Hello, you delicious people. I'm here today to review two movies. Yes, I am here to review the movie The Black Room, and then I am here to also review the movie Girl on the Third Floor. Ultimately, you can go and see The Black Room, ultimately to the second it's recording, on Amazon Prime. Ultimately, if you have the time to check out Prime, you can go and watch this movie. Because ultimately, it's a very horror-like film that at the end of the day has some interesting content that you wouldn't normally see in a lot of other movies. Ultimately, Girl on the Third Floor is still to the second of this recording of this day on Netflix. Go ahead and check this movie out. Without a doubt, is currently on Netflix. Who knows how long it'll be on there for? But at the end of the day, I think it's still an intriguing movie, and I had seen it more than once now. So, because ultimately, I wanted to re-review both of these movies because ultimately, I might have had some of these movies a little bit laced with some adult content. So I thought, let's try to clean up these reviews to ultimately make it so at the end of the day, I could say that I rewatched these films because ultimately I like them, and ultimately I want to make sure that people know that these movies exist. So, let's at first talk about Girl on the Third Floor, which again is a Netflix movie. So, Girl on the Third Floor is ultimately a movie about Don Koch, who ultimately is played by Phil Brooks. CM Punk, WWE wrestler, former WWE wrestler. Well, pro wrestler, former whatever, actor, singer, celebrity, dancer. I don't know, but anyway, Phil Brooks, WWE, former. So, anyways, let's talk about this movie. So, Don Koch goes into a home that basically blows up in his face. Not literally, but it almost gets there. So we have to where Don Koch goes into this brand new home and the home starts falling apart on him. The only thing of this happens is that reasonably it seems that we have it to where Don is coming in here without really much of a game plan. He's just kind of having like a couple of things to his belt at his disposal to try and fix these things. And ultimately, like the more he goes in this house, the more he's finding every single thing is broken. And so reasonably at every time he's kind of just mentioning some little problem to his wife. His wife is just saying like, "Well, hey, how about we just pay someone to fix this? Hey, how about we call the person that sold us this home and try to get like a better deal off of this because we didn't find out how much this stuff was really much more like broken than it was and this and that. We gotta have some labor fees and stuff like that." So going into this, like Don's character is pushed more and more to just this this journey of realizing that this guy has at first like had some really harsh circumstances to push him in wanting to move out of town to a new location. And so now when coming here, nothing is quite going exactly the way he wants it to. And so ultimately, he has had a whole entire backstory about something going horribly awry, which ultimately justifies what kind of happens within this movie. So we ultimately find a man that his home is falling apart around him. But not only that, he is being haunted by seemingly what we would have to suggest is the previous owners or the previous people who had been into this home of, let's just say, Lady of the Night like repute. So, going into this movie, I really thought that it was kind of there's some really interesting moments between Phil and Cooper, or Coop. Ultimately, I have to make people aware. You could say it's a spoiler or not, it doesn't matter to me. I want to make people, surefire people, made aware there is a scene going on in this movie, so that way ultimately they don't come back here and it's like, hey, I didn't know that this is going on in this movie, and I don't like these kinds of things in these kinds of movies. What the F, sir? I'm going to let you know right now, even in cryptic like sense. The man, or say actor, that is Cooper, ultimately, reasonably, his story doesn't exactly, let's just say, end well. So, reasonably, if you're watching this movie and you know who eventually this person is, then hopefully you will not come back here, dislike this video, because I'm letting people know right away the person who is evidently dubbed named this person ultimately ends in a harsh way, which ultimately, hopefully, people will not ultimately dislike. So at the end of the day, let's move on. Going into this movie, I thought, first viewing, I thought, man, like the line deliveries seemed very overly rehearsed, or that reasonably it kind of felt like a lot of these lines were kind of like take after take after take for a lot of these things. And so a lot of them felt like very timed. It was weird. Like all the lines, first watch didn't feel very authentic to me. I think the second viewing just kind of made me either forget about that, or just kind of felt like maybe I was maybe too judging of lines and stuff like that in the first approach. But knowing all full well that there's probably a lot of people that are ultimately, this is like their first real shot at this, and probably there's a lot of stresses going on. There's a lot of just, I don't know if this is going to work, so hopefully it does. So, yeah, you got a lot of people just kind of hoping that this movie is going to go well or do something or achieve. Hopefully, to believe that this movie is really good. So, ultimately, the guy that I believe went into this was, of course, the same guy who went into Dune, so the original Dune. So, anyways, going into the girl on the third floor, we ultimately have Dawn, who is very much driven to fix this home, but then eventually just starts to slip and dip and slide and to be driven into something else. And also, while also being scared while in his home as well. Consistently spooked, seeing ghosts in the machine, let's just say, and you would think at some point, you would think that Don would just be like running out of his house all scared and loony. No. Don is just like, no, I gotta see this through because, like, I bought this house. I bought this house. Um, and then plus reasonably, like, you have other people that are warning them of this house, and ultimately telling them the backstory of this house, letting them know that this home was previously owned by a lady in the night variety, and that ultimately, like, they shouldn't be nowhere near this house. And I think that is the main reason why also there's so many people approaching this house to ultimately like get to like hear their consensuses about this home. So, because it's kind of fairly odd that you have a preacher that ultimately drops by someone's house and really asks them a bunch of questions about things, to ultimately see like where their head's at with his home, which I thought was just kind of weird. Because why would somebody go out of their way to just like, do they really need like people to come to the church that badly? I don't know. But anyways, fairly interesting film. I really enjoyed it, and so let's go into spoilers about this movie. Let's crack down that double five and otherwise start spoiling. Because at the end of the day, it's time to go our way to spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time we're going to spoil this movie. So, girl on that third floor. She's that girl floor. Yeah, girl floor. So now we're in this movie. We're in it for realsies. And so Don, the very beginning of this movie is Don coming into his home, ultimately to yell at Coop, who is ultimately a dog. Hence why I said, more than likely, people may not like this movie at the end of the day. So, Phil, Don, Mr. Brooks, ends up very much like talking to this dog as if it's like a person to talk to, because basically it's just him, and whenever he can like seemingly Skype to his woman that is pregnant, that is at some other establishment, because of course she's pregnant and she's also on business. So what we find out is that Don ultimately had previously left his previous life because ultimately he had done fraud to all of his clients. He had been a attorney of sorts, and he had done fraud to all of his clients. He barely, just nearly missed being put to jail for 10 years, and ultimately he had cheated on his wife in the process, because I guess that guy, like, everything was completely going wrong for him. So ultimately he was just burning every bridge that he could during that process. So we have it to where Don ultimately is going on into his home, ultimately doing something as simple as tearing down a couple of walls to put some more walls up. But it seems like more and more he is finding so many of these walls have some problems with them, to the point where he's spending just a ton of time just like getting to certain rooms and not even getting to the kitchen. So ultimately, we have it to where his wife is consistently checking on him and consistently saying, "Are you sure that you don't want to, like, a handyman just to come in and help you? Like, this is a really extensive job. Like, this is probably going to take a lot of people to clean this home up." Phil's like, "No, I got it. I got it. Believe me, I got it." So he starts to like take care of some portions of the home, but then eventually he finds out some other things that are wrong. Ends up finding out like an entire wall ends up falling out in his home. So he's like, well, I guess I'll have to call my friend Milo in here to help me with that, because I can't do that. So we'll just bang that out. So plus, they'll repaint some of the stuff where there was holes in some of the walls. So we end up having it to where Phil is where Dawn is finding more problems in the house. Eventually, to the point where like plumbing is what is plumbing. Like basically everything with plumbing is horribly awry. Showers don't work. The sink doesn't work. The garbage disposal doesn't really work that well. Everything is just a seemingly money pit and nothing works. So to the point of not really wanting to tell his wife how horrible this house really is, and how like it's getting to the point where he is just non-stoppingly trying to work so hard at this home, to the point where he is driven to just like, you know what, I gotta go out and just get something to eat. I gotta get out of here. I gotta like get out of this home. All the while also going to some bowling alley where ultimately he's asking if they have like what do they have there for food or whatever, because he's just desperately wanting to like go out somewhere. So that's where like told me where Dawn is kind of like mentioning that like he's new in town, and this guy at this bowling alley isn't getting giving him an actually exactly like a really warm reception to this place for him to call his new home. So ultimately telling him that his home usually ultimately previously used to be owned by a lady of the night like company. Ultimately, Don had come to that consensus when ultimately he would kind of be poking through some of the holes of this previous home and find some certain like outfits in there, or find some kind of like bizarrish like things going on in there. So ultimately he's kind of made a consensus of that himself. And also like just eventually seeing all these kinds of weird ish uh like furnitures and stuff like that. Like it's kind of interesting for Phil at some point. I think the big joke is like, who paints a wall pink? Or who paints a room pink? So reasonably we have it to where Don eventually meets this girl named Sarah Yates. Because ultimately, when the the whole pipe situation starts to not really go well for Don, he ends up going out of his home to be met by Sarah, who is very much asking him, it's like, hey, what happened? It's like, well, hey, my pipe busted. So it seems shortly thereafter that it seems that Sarah keeps popping her way into this house, asking like Don how things are going, if he needs anything, if he needs any help, ba 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 ba. The more and more that Sarah seems to keep prodding, the more Don is just kind of letting her in, but then eventually he lets her in on more than just his home, let's just say. He lets her in on himself. And so basically, right after the moment of him having some, let's just say, bedroom business with this woman, ultimately Coop is looking at him like, "What the f? What are you doing?" And ultimately, Phil is like, "You know what? You know how hard I'm working on this house. Like I deserve that. Like I think I deserve getting that." Because ultimately he had like done a bunch of Skypes with his wife, but then eventually he had been kind of looking at some other kind of means and stuff like that. Um, for him being so far away from his wife, because ultimately, yeah, evidently he can't really just legitimately stare at her, let's just say, melons all day long. So we have to where ultimately Don's character ultimately goes into having Milo come to his house. Ultimately, Milo is a previous coworker that ultimately at some point Phil or Don's character owes him one, or Milo owes Don one. So ultimately, he's like, "Hey, whatever you need for this home, I'll help you out." So it seems like all of this stuff is really extensive, but reasonably, Don is really just realizing, man, all of this stuff is really coming together. All I needed was Milo here. The only problem is that Sarah again uh, just pops over and says, "Hey, yeah, like I knocked in the door, Milo let me in, and this and that." And so ultimately, Dawn is just like, "Hey, you know what? Like last night was great, but it seems like you're like popping in here like all the time now. Like I'm gonna remind you that it's like, well, hey, I have a wife, and like last night was great, but yeah, again, um, like I kind of want you to just kind of butt out of my life. It's like there's only so many times that that you can show up unannounced and just kind of like feel like you own the place and this and that. So Sarah ends up not liking that, and so eventually it seems that Sarah at some point is going to get even with Dawn. So reasonably we have it to where Dawn is fixing up some portion of the house. We have Milo, who eventually goes down and is trying to trace this marble that seems to be rolling around in the house. Because marbles roll around in the house all the time. Eventually, Cooper at some point eats the marble, and ultimately, like, Dawn is mentioning, it's like, well, hey, you're the one that has to crap that out later. So we have it to where Milo eventually follows this marble down this flight of stairs and eventually goes down to this uh, lower portion of this home, and eventually we have it to where Sarah is there. Sarah is there to eventually attack Milo, and eventually we have it to where now there are other ghosts that start to appear while Milo is getting decked with this hammer. So ultimately, the very next day, Milo is supposedly gone. Um, so ultimately, like Dawn didn't hear anything. So ultimately, he texts Dawn and ultimately says like, "Hey, like, is everything copacetic? Is everything cool?" And ultimately, Milo says, "Yeah, everything's fine." And he's like, "Whew, like, man, did I piss him off? Like, so ultimately, is he not gonna tell any? Is he gonna tell my wife anything? Anything? What's going on?" So ultimately, we have it to where uh, Don is talking to his wife, ultimately Liz, and ultimately he is kind of talking about how like great work that they've done and how reasonably like isn't it great, like, hey, we fixed all this stuff, and seemingly like in the background Liz is noticing that there is someone behind Dawn, and so reasonably he's like, what, like, where did it come from? And so like Liz starts to tell him like where it's coming from, and ultimately she's freaking out. He's like, hey, you're freaking out, but I'm the one that has to sleep here tonight. So ultimately Don is trying to look through the house. He can't find anybody, and so reasonably Don is just going, oh yeah, like uh and so ultimately Liz is trying to figure out like who it could be. Like, yeah, could it be Dawn? Could it be, or could it be like Dawn? Could it be yourself? Dawn? Could it be Milo? Could it be like a neighbor? Like, who could it be? Because I'm ultimately seeing someone in the background consistently. So Milo just kind of washes off as like, nah, maybe you did, like, you really didn't see anything. Like, I'm not really seeing anything, and I'm completely fine. But ultimately, in the back of his mind, he's probably thinking that's probably Sarah, because everything is tied to this Sarah girl. So ultimately, like, he kind of just fluffs it off, and basically, she is just like, well, okay, well, all right, well, hopefully, you have a nice night. And he's like, well, hey, maybe I'll just sleep with a pillow under my, or a hammer under my bed, or a hammer under my pillow. Um, so yeah, she's like, oh, okay, all right, well, maybe I just saw whatever. So it ends up that we have to get to the point of finding out what happens to Cooper. So if there is just a lot of funny moments going on with Dawn and Cooper, here's when we don't get quite so funny, and we don't get quite so sad moment. So we ultimately have it to where it seems that Cooper eventually wakes at some point within the next day to ultimately hear this consistent knocking. He ultimately figures out that it is at his seemingly dryer. So he goes ahead and checks out his dryer to find out the head of his dog is in the dryer, and that makes him barf. So we ultimately have it to where, of course, Don is immediately assuming that uh, it is, of course, Sarah that is doing all this, and that ultimately he even calls the police on Sarah, who he doesn't even know who her last name is, and yeah, uh, so we have to where ultimately Phil eventually goes into this home and eventually just continues to very much start to see problems within the home. It seems more and more he's starting to see stuff at some point. It seems that he is uh like putting holes uh through his walls to otherwise see like seemingly hearts being placed within uh the walls, or ultimately he is seeing Milo's head in the wall, and he's like, "Oh my god!" To the point to where ultimately Phil has to put a camera uh, through the wall to ultimately get spooked by some spirit-like thing. But here's the thing that we have to get to before this. So we ultimately have it to where Don can't call the cops on Sarah because it seems like nothing is really going to truly happen. So what ends up happening is that Don ends up having Sarah appear yet again to apologize to her. To ultimately mention that he is sorry for all the things that he did. He realizes like the mistakes that he's made, and ultimately he wants to like now give her like some kind of present to make up for all of this. And Sarah's just like, really, you're gonna try to bribe me right now? And ultimately he's like, take it for what you will, like I'm trying to be very sincere about all this, and this and that. So Sarah ends up going to the kitchen, and Sarah is met with a hammer to the back of the head presented by good old Phil Brooks. So the present was that Sarah was going to die, and we have to where Sarah is ending up getting wrapped up in uh, this cloth like thing and shoved down into the bottom of this home to probably be like cemented somewhere. All the while, because uh, Don is kind of driven to this insane like place, and so recently he is just consistently living in this, just like, God, I am so frightened, I'm so scared, and this home is just the only thing that I have left, and it's turning into crap. And now I have like a woman that is coming after me, and everything's going horribly awry. So justifiably, of course, his wife calls him at the wrong time, ultimately while he is in the process of hiding this potty, ultimately mentioning how like she is like coming home, and then ultimately asking a bunch of questions, kind of just a lot of just questions about stuff. And so ultimately Milo had texted her, supposedly Milo, but it wasn't actually Milo, it was actually Sarah, saying that Milo has something that he needs to tell her. And ultimately, Sarah is calling Milo and is like, hey, like, what is this text about? Is there something wrong with the house? Is there something wrong with Like, what is Milo gonna have to tell me? And and Dawn is just like, I don't know. It's like, if anything, go ahead and you call him. Like, do not call me to ask me a question. Like, call the person that will give you the answer. I don't know what Milo's problems are. So it just gets to the point where ultimately he is just like fed up, and he's like, you know what? Like, I have so much work I gotta do here. I am so overwhelmed that I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go. So he hangs up on his on hangs up with his wife. Eventually, he ends up finding this seemingly spirit, uh, yet again, kind of show up right in front of him, because we have it to where these marbles are consistently rolling through his house, but this time around, the marbles start to not only roll through his house, but then roll into his body, into his skin, to where eventually you can see it protruding out through his entire body. To where ultimately you can see the marbles like rolling through his skin, which I thought was really interesting. So we have it to where Dawn is consistently having all these balls like roll through his entire skin, to where eventually we have even more marbles that are all eventually going to go inside uh, Dawn's skin, and we are naturally to assume that is how Dawn dies, is just by being killed by numerous marbles going through his body over and over and over again. And so, because reasonably he has end up like he's cutting through his body trying to get the marbles out, and ultimately it's very hard for them to come out, and so ultimately he's just kind of cutting himself up in the process of trying to get these marbles out. So that is what ends up being Dawn's demise, and that's what ends up getting him dead, to lead us to have the wife coming back home to no one. No, no Cooper, no Dawn. She ultimately assumes that that her husband is out for a walk with her dog, and that he'll be back soon, but gets to the point where there's a lot of stuff going on. So we end up finding out that reasonably the wife gets to know that there's something wrong with this house, because there's a numerous amount of people all telling Phil that there's something wrong with this house, and he's just kind of like, nah, whatever. So we have it to where a priest consistently comes to this person's home, and eventually, when the wife comes, uh, Liz tells the preacher about his backstory and about his rough trials and everything like that, and ultimately, the priest tells her to get out of that house. What ends up happening is that uh, Liz ends up coming home to some kind of party, which ultimately we are assumed that it is thrown by Dawn, but Dawn is not even home. Eventually, Liz ends up going into the upper portion of this home to eventually find that her wall, or new wall that had been put up, or ceiling that had been put up in one room, is now gone, and that there is a bunch of suit and tie Ashlight guys all around this balcony part watching this performance of this act of sorts, to where there's two people dancing around performing this act, and ultimately she's like, what is going on? She is desperate to try to figure out where her husband is. She is calling him, trying to figure out where he is. His phone is in the same building that she's at, and she's like, God, where is Dawn? I can't figure this out. So it gets to the point to where, of course, within this movie, that reasonably, the more and more that they they try to scare this woman away, the more research she tries to do on the home, and ultimately the research that she ends up doing ultimately ends up trying to figure out how to beat this whole thing. And all while trying to beat this whole thing, eventually it gets to the point to where ultimately she delivers her baby. And all while thinking that everything is all copacetic within this house again, that everything is back to normal, and everything is all okay, at the end of the day, we have Phil Brooks watching over his baby in the crib, ultimately dropping marbles down and talking to her. So, yeah, like if the house seemed to be all clear and clean and cut and finished up and just kind of like, okay, yeah, like this house is done with, not quite. So, yeah, um, very interesting, like movie, kind of just. Mm, the ending is just kind of like very very rough, and yeah, it's just like probably the best part's just like, okay, like kind of telling me that this movie's gonna be wrapping up soon. All right, so at the end of the day, that's all I want to say about Girl on the Third Floor. And yeah, so let's go into The Black Room. So The Black Room, we have it to where in this movie is having a one portioned room in this home that bizarrely seemed to be barricaded, because bizarrely some woman wanted to keep some house because ultimately she had realized that she could uh, keep this demon dormanted into this house. I would be thinking, you know what, how about just let someone else take care of this burden and move your happy out of this place. But I guess like for her, it's like, no, I gotta protect this thing. So we have it to where within this movie there are some bizarre things going on within this film. There are there is this thing called a succubus or succubus, a incubus. What was I thinking? An incubus, and ultimately this character we find out is very much a uh, adult content as like demon wanting to press the boundaries of getting somebody to, let's just say, explode with sensations of sorts. So going into this movie, I would say that there is a lot of stuff done in joking ways, or there's a lot of stuff done in like a play on words. To me, this movie a lot of times feels like the movie The Wishmaster to me, or just kind of feels like a wish like scenario where it seems that if um, what what Paul ends up asking for or thinks that somebody wants, ultimately they don't want, well, they're going to get it anyways. So, yeah, this movie kind of goes into, at first, it seems that everything is going haywire into this home. To ultimately, they're kind of like calling everybody to kind of fix things, and all while seemingly fixing things, what really gets end up fixing is whoever is really fixing the stuff. That's the thing that gets fixed. Yeah. So basically, just to sneer more people to come on to being a part of this movie, because you kind of gotta drag it on for a little bit more to figure out who is all otherwise tied to this process. So, the Black Room. I really liked this movie. If anything, there is like some kind of funny journeys that went about this movie, and of course there really is like I think there is some good story here. I think some effects or some stuff in here could be hit or miss. But I thought overall I kind of just liked the story. I got a good chuckle at it, some of the stuff that went on into this. And I really just kind of just thought it like it's a fun movie. I think that it's a fun movie that kind of goes into a very raunchy like variety and has like some very dark or gritty like moments. And ultimately just kind of reminds me of a lot of these kind of like haunted-ish like houses where at the end of the day you would have to like forcibly possess someone to ultimately get them to do what you want them to do. Yeah, pretty much going to this movie. Really, I thought it was it was a fun film. Ultimately, if people don't know what it is or don't know what it's about, it's a very enjoyable film, and I like it. So hopefully, at the end of the day, people will go out of your way to say you saw this film at some point, or ultimately just I don't know, just check it out. It was interestingly enough for me to re-review, so there's a whole entire reason for me to mention that. So let's just pray. Let's just blah, a lot of reviews at this point. Let's break into ultimately going into spoilers of this movie. So at the end of the day, let's go out of our way to spoil this film. I really didn't mention much about this movie because ultimately there's not really much to that I can really mention, just because a lot of it is just moments of just like the adult variety. So there's some stuff that I can't mention, or most stuff that I can't mention. But there's some kind of funny moments here that ultimately kind of make this a very funny movie, but very raunchy as well. So at the end of the day, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So going into this film, we have Jennifer, we have Paul, and we have eventually Karen, who eventually make their way into this house. But before that, we have Miss Black, who ultimately is very much a previous homeowner that is trying to keep this seemingly demon incubus at bay. So we kind of find out that there is some medallion that is keeping this incubus at bay, and ultimately, when the incubus eventually uh, gets beyond this talisman, is much more powerful, and eventually does whatever he kind of wants within this home. Mrs. Black mentions to this incubus, to this demon, we'll just say demon for the rest of the movie, that reasonably it's like that reasonably she will not let him do whatever he wants, and also that this incubus demon won't do whatever he wants with her with her daughter or with her niece or something, uh Dawn. We'll just say it's Dawn. So ultimately, while the demon is hearing about this, like, oh, there's another woman besides Miss Black here. So immediately we have it to where kind of Miss Black is kind of squirming in her bed, but then eventually the demon heads on to Dawn. Dawn is a much younger girl who is fast asleep, but ultimately gets awakened by, let's just say, a seemingly ghost touch. So, metaphorical terms, forcibly. So we end up having Miss Black double checking on Dawn and interrupting a seemingly invisible dance session, let's just say. And eventually, Miss Black is is going, "Oh, I just wanted to make sure that you were okay for the night, and maybe you should really just put your clothes back on." So it ends up being that Miss Black is very much frustrated that excuse me, she is not strong enough to seemingly really keep this demon at bay. So she very much even goes closer to the room to make sure that this demon obeys her wishes and that he does nothing. So, reason of this demon that at this point in juncture you cannot see until eventually within this movie. This demon eventually sucks Miss Black into this black room, and then eventually Dawn goes out um, to see her mother and gets a a fire full of flames from this furnace for her trouble, burning her skin. So, reasonably within this movie, we have new owners come in, and ultimately these new owners ultimately just see a door that is locked, and they're kind of like, "What the heck? What is up? Why don't we have a key for this?" Because ultimately, once they start getting repairmen in there, they start getting guys for the plumbing and the washer and dryer and everything like that. Uh, like especially the plumber is asking like, hey, like where does this door lead, because ultimately like I want to see what the plumbing is in this, if this has any plumbing that is tied to this room. So eventually we have this plumber working down in the cellar, but then eventually of course this plumber eventually gets sucked into this door as well. Because reasonably what ends up happening is um, he ends up fiddling with the door, and the door seemingly comes unlocked for him, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I must have just jiggled it the right way." So he goes in the room, and then ultimately he starts being uh, like coming through there, and he can't really see anything, and ultimately he ends up eventually just getting grabbed and getting sucked into this room, and to where he can't get out. To ultimately the door closes on him and crushes his fingers, and like yeah, so eventually he gets sucked in this room. So we have it to where ultimately Paul goes down there to talk to the repairman, and ultimately he of course doesn't see him anymore, so he just assumes that he had left for the day. So, anyways, we have it to where eventually within this movie that Paul and Jennifer are seemingly going to cement or christen their new home within their bedroom. And so, reasonably, that is what they're doing. It's been a while since they've been able to be together. So, ultimately, Paul is trying to sweeten the deal for Jennifer's character to be in the mood, and so ultimately, it seems like Jennifer is like, "Well, hey, maybe we can get some together." Like, but like, don't hold me to that. So Jennifer gets into the tub ultimately to wash off all the dirtiness that had been when they were moving, and Paul ends up going into the bed to rest, or what to rest up for the bedroom business that they are going to quite possibly have. What ultimately happens instead is that ultimately Paul ends up getting a ghost touchy feely from down below, if you know what I mean. All the while, eventually, also we have it to where Jennifer ends up getting um, a little bit too much of a happy ending in her bath, to where all of a sudden her water is acting a little bit more unusual than most times. So going into this movie, we have it to where ultimately uh, Jennifer is ready to go, but Paul is like, well, uh, he had naturally assumed the spirit underneath his bed sheets was actually Jennifer, and ultimately when she appears, ultimately he just naturally still assumes it's her, and that ultimately she just bizarrely wants around too, but he's not quite ready. So ultimately, he blows her off seemingly because she's like, "Oh my god, what? Like, oh, so you're just like giving me crap now because I didn't like jump when you said how high? What the f?" So reasonably gets to the point where eventually Karen is to make her way to this home because reasonably this is a girl that just kind of goes from place to place for a while. So Karen ends up coming in here and she's like very pale. Like it's obvious that it's kind of like makeup pale. So that way eventually when she legitimately has to like shift at some point, like they kind of slowly but surely kind of taper off the whole makeup thing and they just kind of just like go with like a much more natural look because that makeup like obviously like does not like they were trying to make her look gothic or whatever, but it just like it didn't look right obviously. So when Karen eventually goes into this home. Eventually, she gets to the aspect of asking, like how Jennifer and Paul's relationship are going, because ultimately it seems like she never really liked Paul, and it seems like Paul and her kind of like really trying to get together, but ultimately he really hates her, and ultimately he is just kind of seeing her as a blocker of sorts, if you want to catch my drift there. So we have it to where Paul eventually at some point is going into the downstairs. Uh, and ultimately he's going downstairs because he heard a noise, and so ultimately here's where we get to the point of needing to hire a technician for the dryer. So ultimately, we have it to where Paul goes down to see if there's anything else that needs future fixing because there's a ton of that. And so eventually, Paul ends up getting sucked into this room to be possessed by this demon for the rest of this movie, or for a bulk of this movie. So this demon ends up wanting to put the moves on Jennifer, but if anything, because ultimately he's like really uh, throwing himself at Jennifer and she's not taking the bait. At some point, uh, Jennifer, Paul, and Karen all go out to eat, and reasonably, since Jennifer is not giving him the time of day, Paul is eventually just kind of hitting on anything that moves and basically trying very much to make it a very extremely difficult working condition for anybody that works at this restaurant, getting to the point to where like he is basically like sucking the size out of, let's just say, a woman's chest, ultimately having her just like, hey, what happened? like i like I want this, like I want this back to normal, like I want this back. And so ultimately she ends up having her chest being placed onto the wrong part of her body, her actual back. If you see the scene in the movie, you'll understand what I'm saying, but I have to cryptically talk about freaking everything. Let's just say her melons landed on the wrong side of her body, let's just say. Uh, when she asks for them back. So we also have it to where ultimately there is a girl that is hard up because ultimately Paul is asking for her to kind of drop whatever she's doing to service him, and ultimately she's like, well, hey, I just went on my 10-minute break, and he's like, well, hey, like the only thing that I want here is you. And so reasonably, like, she's like, wow, like, I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not on the menu, and this and that, and just kind of condescendingly, it's like, well, he's propositioning her that reasonably he is to the point of, like, well, hey, like, I can definitely make you want to change your mind about everything by giving you this mind bending explosion of eruption inside of you. So basically, this girl heavily declines, and then ultimately, while they are finding and dining their way through this restaurant, it seems that Karen and Jennifer are kind of picking up on the fact that he's throwing his uh, metaphorical Johnson at everybody, and so reasonably, they're really put off about that, and like, what the heck is going on? So, because ultimately, even kind of Jennifer at points is mentioning how Paul is just kind of so different, and but ultimately she is consistently justifying it to Karen at a lot of points as well. So we have it to where Paul, while they're waiting for their food, he is playing with the waitress that ultimately had given him crap before. So ultimately, he is very much like playing around with her to where ultimately she is like pretty much unable to like stand and pretty much unable to like do her job to the point to where she is just uh, like grabbing onto the walls, like grabbing onto all kinds of things. It gets to the point to where like all the other waiters have to like help her out and try to like get her to a place where she'll be okay. But anyways, it ends up being that like Paul is kind of attacking pretty much everybody at this restaurant. So at the end of the day, yeah, I wonder if they got any of their food or this and that. But all the while, basically, Paul is consistently mentioning to not only Jennifer but to Karen about all of the backstory about this home, and recently, every single time, he is mentioning that he had gotten this information from the realtor because he ultimately had backtracked and asked her about stuff, which ultimately is a lie. So, justifiably, we have it to where Paul is really laying it on thick to Jennifer, ultimately mentioning like, "Hey, like tonight's the night. Like I'm gonna uh, like like I have perfected my body for this moment and this and that." And so Jennifer is like, you know what? Like I don't really like how thick you were throwing yourself at these other waitresses. I don't like what you were doing tonight. I don't like how you were acting with my sister. So you know what? Like not tonight. And Paul was just like, well, like it's like he was basically just throwing it on like thick mortars, like, well, no, like if anything, like you're gonna like if anything you're gonna wish that you had some of this. And so basically she ends up throwing him out of the room to forcing him to go into like sleeping on the couch. So instead Paul shifts his eyes on otherwise Jennifer's sister. So eventually Paul goes into Jennifer's sister's room and ultimately really kind of showcases to Jennifer uh, like what or not to Jennifer. Uh, Paul goes to Karen to showcase what Jennifer is missing because ultimately uh, he is getting to the point of desperately just wanting to fit get something out of this. If ultimately he couldn't get the main event with Jennifer, then I guess he'll have to settle with second best. So he goes and starts to lay it thick on Karen, and ultimately Karen is just you know what, maybe I will just let it slide of you showing me your deformity, uh but yeah, like no, go away. So reasonably, Paul just gets frustrated, and you know what, he just magically just goes, he controls her, and he's to the point where it's you know what, I'm gonna get this whether you want it, or I'm gonna give you this whether you want it or not, because for a person that loves the supernatural demons and this and that, ultimately, I'm kind of shocked that you wouldn't want a piece of this. So basically it gets to the point to where Paul uh, gives her all of his lovin', whether she likes it or not, and ultimately ends up killing her very, very just wow. To the point to where eventually she ends up, let's just say, breaking her mouth through not so normal means. Uh, yeah. Uh, so we end up having it to where the laundryman comes down to town and ultimately goes into fixing this girl's washer. So we have it to where Paul is kind of giving him the rundown of okay, hey, yeah, this was what broken. I'm gonna go leave. The washer fixer upper guy. I think his name in this movie is, well, the actor's name is James Duval, which ultimately I know him from Independence Day, and I've seen him in a couple of films here and there. I even saw him in Ocean's 11, and yeah, a couple other things. I know I probably had reviewed some movie of him being in. God, he was in some movie. He was in some movie theater, and I think the movie would have been called maybe Blue something. I'm trying to think of what the title is, but ultimately I don't have IMDb in hand. I just have the actors' names, and that's pretty much all I have. So, but I know that also has some quasi content of certain kinds. Anyways, so the Black Room, we have mechanic fixing stuff, fixing a washer, all while presenting to be having, while this dryer guy is assessing some noise, he turns back around to find Karen on top of this washer. So ultimately, he's like, wow, you are hot. So ultimately, Karen is into more than him just fixing this washer. And so ultimately, Karen is fixing him to the point of ultimately uh, having them just get down right next to this washer. All the while, this guy's head is placed where the his neck is right by where where you would put the door of the washer. So basically what ends up happening is when they are in the ways of getting bedroom busy, basically what ends up happening is Karen ends up smashing the washer door on this guy numerous times, breaking his nose, breaking his jaw, breaking his face over and over again, to the point of him losing his head into the washer. over and over again, just getting smashed to the point of his head just being ripped off. So, score yet another one for the home and everybody else. So, reasonably, Paul's grand master plan is kind of working out. So, eventually, without a doubt, Paul ends up going and seemingly consistently meeting with his co-worker slash friend in the end. His co-worker is kind of mentioning how his wife is desperately wanting him to lose weight, and ultimately that he won't be able uh, to get any bedroom situations until he loses 10 or 20 pounds. Who cares? But ultimately, I guess it is what it is. But ultimately, we really find out that this girl is just like repressing her, let's just say, bedtime, if you know what I mean. Metaphorical bedtime. So, yeah. So, we go into here and we have Paul who is introducing his friend to come to his home for a party and this and that. So, they come. And ultimately, Paul is just like, well, hey, yeah, this is great. So ultimately, Paul takes his friend to ultimately go down to what he is calling some kind of dungeon. Well, his friend is calling some kind of dungeon or some kind of like special room. And so ultimately, Paul is taking him into this room to be sucked sucked into this room. Because ultimately, what happens in this room consistently is that a lot of hands kind of grab these people and suck them into this room. There are different kinds of forms of like a wall that ends up kind of grabbing onto someone and grabbing them all over to the point of utterly just exceedingly just uh, extravagantly interesting like ways. Ultimately, Dawn ends up having that same portion of way of which an entire wall starts to grab hands out to get to her, and she eventually ends up experiencing said something, but then eventually it lands her into a furnace to get her body burnt up. So all the while, we eventually have at some point Jennifer trying to get some more knowledge about this home, and ultimately she bumps into Dawn via this journey of trying to figure out information about this home, trying to contact the realtor, and so Dawn ultimately kind of tells her about some stories and stuff like that about what happened in the home, and then ultimately there's a medallion that will protect her, and ultimately, that's what Jennifer eventually gets. So, eventually, to the other woman that is in this home, that eventually is going to just be, eventually just kind of put throughout this home to eventually just be sucked down into the black room as well. Because basically, Paul ends up talking her down into the black room as well, and then eventually she just gets sucked in there as well. So at the end of this, we have to where Jennifer is asking what happened to their friends, and ultimately, Paul mentions that they had gotten into an argument, and ultimately uh, stormed out, and this and that. So Jennifer eventually gets a hold of the realtor and ultimately is telling Paul, it's like, well, hey, like I just talked to the realtor, and Paul is just like, well, yeah, like I know that she told you that not all of the stuff um, that I told you about Mrs. Black and Dawn and everything came from her, and I know that that everything's that I seem to know about everything's coming out of thin air and all this and that. And so now I'm going to tell you the truth. Paul is telling the truth because ultimately he has some master plan to ultimately let Jennifer know that her home is going to have a baby. When I say baby, it also seems very much like a rebirth of the same person. Because realistically, this house needed to accumulate a certain number of people to ultimately have enough juice, let's just say, to churn a new kind of demon that ultimately will be able to get out of this home, because ultimately Paul is seemingly stuck within this home and he can't really go much of anywhere else beyond uh, maybe a certain kind of peripheral like zone. So going into this movie, we have it to where Jennifer is finally thrusted into this black room with all these people that had been throughout this entire movie been accumulating through several murders and stuff like that. Eventually, Jennifer finds Karen and is like, "Oh my God, she's dead!" And it's like, "Yeah, your sister's dead. I killed her." So basically, Paul is telling Jennifer what all had happened, and then ultimately that they are going to eventually have a child into the world. So eventually, Paul ends up sucking um, the demon out of himself, and we have it to where uh, Miss Black grabs Paul for Jennifer to pull the umbilical cord that had sprouted upon Paul to save Paul to be not so esh like suck the life out of. So we have it to where ultimately that this baby is going to be, this new demon is going to be born, and it is going to seemingly explode this house. And so reasonably we have it to where the demon comes out, and ultimately Miss Black is telling her to run, Jennifer and Paul are running, and so ultimately this new demon is now a female, and ultimately telling uh, that how great she will be and this and that. So eventually we have it to where ultimately they end up killing what they think is said demon, and so ultimately they think that, well, because what happens is they end up kind of via the medallion, they kind of force this thing back into the room and think that they utterly control it, and think that they can just take this whole thing down and force it back to the room like per usual, because medallions and this and that. But we have it to where ultimately we have to where Paul and Jennifer are just like, you know what? How about we go back to our old apartment? We give up this home and just like go back to where once we were. So of course they do, and ends up they have like a really nice love scene at the end of this. But we end up finding out that the demon all along was actually not in that home. She was actually in the wife towards the end of this movie. And that's how this movie just kind of ends, with us thinking that she has red eyes. No, she's the demon. And the whole front about her trying to trap this demon was an entirely a facade, and this and that. So really interesting end of this movie, but at the end of it all, I kind of rushed through quite a bit of this review, but I've also kind of put on the bullet points of a lot of this. So at the end of the day, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.